Hi, everybody. We're live on Making Memorable Travel Photos. Um, I've got a presentation today to run through and discuss, but before I get started on it, I want to say hi to everybody and also to say that I'm very open to questions as I go along. The best way to ask me a question is to send it to me on the using the chat function. I'm keeping my eye on the chat box. When I see it, I'll read it out. You can either send it as a public or a private email. So this is Making Memorable Travel Photos, and if you're here for black and white or model photography, it's arguably the wrong webinar. I'm loading up the presentation right now as we speak. The question that I start my presentation with, as you'll see after I go through the preliminaries, is what exactly is travel photography? This is a more difficult question than meets the eye. If I ask what is a professional travel photographer, I do know how to answer that question. A professional travel photographer, and there aren't too many of them anymore, is somebody who makes their living by selling stories and images to magazines like National Geographic or Traveler, or like my friend Bill Bachman works with cruise companies and people like that who are big consumers of photographs of destinations. Short of that, though, if you're somebody who enjoys photography for other reasons than fully commercial, it's not 100% clear what exactly being a travel photographer means. How is being a travel photographer different than photographing the way one does at home? How should it be different? What should the goals that one is going for should be? Are you focused on landscape? Are you focused on people? What, in fact, is unique about a travel photo? I tell you the one thing that I'd like people who watch this presentation to come away with, and that is the ability to make images of places, whether they be near or far, that are not boring. So I think that's my number one criteria. I'm Harold Davis, photographer and author. This is Making Memorable Travel Photos. Here are covers of some of my books, which use pictures from places near and far, many of which are arguably travel photography. The cover of the Spanish edition of my black and white book shows that from the viewpoint of somebody in Spain, we're a travel destination potentially. And that should be true of many of the other books that I've written. And this slide here has how to reach me. The most important data point there is probably my email address, because I'm committed and enjoy corresponding about photography with and everybody who writes it. Lisa, I see that you're not seeing any slides. What do you see on your screen? And also, do you see a help button with up on the upper right of the sounds like a bandwidth issue. Okay, well, let's move on. I don't particularly care about a picture of me. Do you now see a picture saying, what is a travel photo? Okay, good. So these kids were playing in rural Cuba in a basically an irrigation trench. And, at home, they're kids in a playground. When you're traveling abroad and it's a place fairly exotic, it's a travel photo. The town of Bolinas, California, across a narrow estuarial channel of water from Stinson Beach, has a July 4th annual tug of war contest with Stinson Beach across the water. The winning team each year gets to keep the trophy and gets engraved on it for the year. This is Bolinas Beach's last year's winning team, and it's basically the fire department at Bolinas Beach. So, I watched the parade for a while. I went up to these guys who celebrated with a number of beers, and I said to them, you mind if I take a few photos? And the key point with this kind of photo, if you're wandering around at some event, whether it be in coastal California or North Africa, is to be ready. When you say, can I do it, you better be ready to do it and not make them wait a lot for it. This is a dragon sculpture down in the Anza Borrega Desert with the sunrise behind it under the fang of the dragon there. And part of the way you make a photo like this is if you're going to be there at sunrise, you've got to use tools like the photographer's ephemeris and that's tpe.com, to check out when the sun is going to come up and plot yourself so that you're where you can be to capture it, because you aren't going to have very long to line whatever you want up with sunrise and sunset. I want to check, Lisa, that you're still seeing the slides that I'm talking about and that I haven't fallen behind the slideshow. Good. Photography is able to capture light that's reflected or emitted by a subject. It's not able to capture anything in and of itself if it doesn't reflect or emit light. So the key point in making an image like this, one of this antique Russian workbench up above in Fort Ross Historic Park on the coast of California, is to observe the light, and when the light's interesting, you take the photo. It's not about this is an interesting tourist stop, let's get on the bus and off the bus. It's about being able to wait long enough to see whether the light's good, and also when the light is good, to make the photo, no matter what else is going on around you. And a normal bend in the woods near Green Gulch Zen Monastery on the side of Marin Headlands, but it becomes a mysterious picture in the fog. Again, it's about looking for the quality of the light at the time you take the photo rather than rushing through a place. Near Page, Arizona, in one of the slot canyons, the point again is to look for the light and to see the light flowing and carving and sculpturing the rock. This image of a railroad trestle bridge in Colorado, I was testing out how sharp my new 15 millimeter Zeiss lens was. And so I was standing up there and I looked at the composition and I said, this needs something here. So I asked my friend who had driven me up here to get in his van and to drive back and forth with the van. And then when the van lined up between the trestle bridge and the tree you see on the right, I snapped the photo. So a interesting issue from a compositional point of view is that backgrounds are important as well as foregrounds. You want something interesting in the foreground, but you also want some connection and something interesting in the background as well. Great portrait photographers know this is true. They want an interesting person, but they also want a background that's good. But that's also true in more general photographs that show a place as well. This is a somewhat unusual view of the Eiffel Tower and the skyline of Paris. It makes it look almost like it was in the 19th century. I was in the gallery above Sacré-Cœur on Montmartre in Paris to take the photo. And it's many hundreds of stairs up to this place, not something that many tourists do. It's more Parisian couples who come up there to sign their names in the stone. So the moral here is not only look for the light, but also look for vistas that aren't as typical as the ones that people normally do. Light is best typically early in the day and late in the day. Sometimes I think that when I'm traveling, what I can do is go to sleep in the middle of the day, wake up for sunset and a little bit after sunset, and then come back in early in the morning. So this pier in mid California at Cayucas was really just best as I waited there as the dusk came on and the fog came in a bit, and it got this neat misty swirling stuff in a nice long exposure. In the southwest of France, the Dordogne and Vézère rivers coming together below. So the confluence of the river in this shot is what occupies the foreground. And yet, as you start looking back into the distance of it, past these fairly modern but wonderful bridges, you see the cloudy sky in the background. So again, you have an example of combining a background and a foreground that leads to an interesting total composition. When I travel, I like to try when I can to be careful about where I stay, because often at the best light times of day, the ones that I mentioned, the evening and morning, exactly where one is in or near one's hotel room. So there are a number of the images that are in this presentation that talk about the hotel room that I stayed in. In this case, this was in the old capital of Aquitaine, Bourg, in southern France, and it had been raining all day. I finally found my way around the maze of one-way streets in this old town and found my way into this hotel room that was actually up an old watchtower. And as I sat there, I watched the light come out and the sunset come on and the cathedral lit up, and I was able to make this image. So it pays to think thoughtfully and ask for rooms with views and that kind of thing, and try and choose places to stay where you're likely to get good views. I'm waiting at this point for the slide to change, but while I wait, I can talk a little about what you're going to see next, which is the town of Nachisan in rural Japan. This is on the Kii Peninsula. And fundamentally, this is a place kind of like Lourdes in France, where Japanese people make religious tours. There are a whole bunch of different temple complexes there, ranging from the Buddhist temple complex in the front to the pagoda-style temple you see in the background. Both a number of different religions and sects are really represented here, and the whole place has a feel like a Shangri-La to me. When you hike the ancient pilgrimage trail of the Kumano Kodo, you come out here finally and you see this waterfall and in the distance the Pacific Ocean. So it's quite a magical place. When I made this image, my thought was to try to make it feel like Shangri-La, because that's what the place felt like. So my moral here is that to make memorable travel photos, it is very often the case that you have to get out and walk. You don't see places when you're riding in a car, and you don't see them when you're riding in a bus nearly as much. The White Mountains between the California and Nevada border, a couple of hours after night. Why not do travel photos at night? That's a view that is unusual, that people don't see, and is, of course, wonderful and magical. When I'm doing night photography workshops in a place like the Patriarch Grove in the White Mountains with these old bristlecone pines, what I typically do is I set up my camera, I put the intervalometer on, and I let it do whatever it's going to do. The lightning you see on the right happened while I was doing that, while I was wandering from person to person in the dark, helping them with their photos. And in the meantime, my camera was taking these images of the star trails and the lightning is just a bonus. How do you deal with a place like Notre Dame, for example, where you really are not going to be allowed to use your tripod inside the cathedral? How do you make an interesting photo there? One approach is to move your camera, kind of the opposite of the approach in the Star Trail shots I just showed. Here, what I like to do is I like to try to see if I can make the inside of a cathedral look like a landscape. I slowly move the camera up and I slowly move it down. Exposures like this tend to work best in the half a second to 1 second range. You really don't want them too incredibly long or everything falls apart. But you also you also want them long enough so it's clear that the emotion in them is not something that it was an accident, but that you did it on purpose and as part of your technique. This is an idea to think about. I assure you that if you put this in your travel photography collection, it'll be a technique that most people won't have seen. A garden and park in the suburbs of Paris, these trees have been treated through a kind of trimming called pollarding. And as I looked up with my wide-angle lens, my extreme wide-angle lens, I saw what seemed to be a sort of straight division line. So an image like this depends on the kind of quality of the light there, but is also about what kind of pattern can you make out of it. So the next thing to look for is patterns. On a rainy day in Tokyo, I was just wandering around with my camera. Simple shot. Saw these umbrellas, said, hey, they're very nice and colorful. It makes a really nice little print, too. It's not an image that requires a great deal of thought. It's basically just about the patterns and the colors of the umbrellas. And as if you look at it in the print, I'm not sure if you can see this in the online version of it, the water drops on the edges of the umbrellas are pretty clear. I have a section coming up, and this is the first of them, I think, of images taken with my iPhone. I really believe in carrying the camera that's always with one and using it. I would never probably have bothered with my big camera to photograph this wall graffiti in Paris, but it's really fun to be able to shoot things with your iPhone that you wouldn't take with a big camera, and it's also fun to be able to process them right on the iPhone. So I'm a real proponent of iPhone photography for when one travels. It also means that I'm never bored because wherever I am, I've got photos in my photo album that I can work on and process in my iPhone. Here's an example from the Luxembourg Gardens, an iPhone shot. It makes a really nice small print too. I wouldn't print something like this too big, but strangely, when you print it, depending on the surface you print it on, it has a wonderful old-fashioned look. So I recommend very much carrying an iPhone camera and using it for travel photography. Some of the time, I almost think about carrying nothing else. You get these great old-fashioned looks using apps like Snapseed and Lowmob. Everybody uses their iPhone on airplanes. Just a second, Bob. Everyone uses their iPhones on airplanes, and it's a great way to while away the time. Usually my real camera is up above in the luggage rack, so I had fun with this one. Bob wants to know whether I use the version of Lightroom for my iPhone, and the answer is no, I do not. Maybe someday I will, maybe I should, but I haven't been using it. I haven't been using the mobile Lightroom. I probably would use it on my iPad, not my iPhone, if I were using it. I kind of like to keep the iPhone processing pretty simple, actually. You may not look like it, but these are really, running them through one or two different filters and kind of enjoying the results. A big cathedral in Germany via iPhone. This is an image of this famous watering spot in Paris, Les Deux Magots, that Hemingway and others frequented. The waiters still wearing skirts, probably the same costume they wore back then. Would have been hard to get this with a normal camera because people would have changed what they were doing. They would have looked at me. As it is, it's a very almost pseudo-antique look and quite possible to shoot with an iPhone because everyone ignores what you do with an iPhone. It's great. And I also like the kind of painterly effects you can get in using iPhone imagery and processing for places like this in the old town of Chartres in France, where there are these houses that date back to the 13th century, and there's a canal down there. And when the light's right, you can process it and make really beautiful images. So part of what you want to do when you travel abroad is you want to know enough about your surroundings so that you're not a total stranger. I personally like to research where I'm going. I want to understand a bit about the culture, and I also want to talk to people when I'm there if I can. If I know a little bit of the language, that's a good thing. I want also, if I'm going to walk pilgrimage trails in Japan, as this is an example of, and stay in monasteries, I'm going to go to ceremonies like this fire service shown here. And I may not understand what's going on, and I may have no more belief in a fire service than I do in a service in a Catholic church in France, but it's good to be respectful, and it's a way to see images that you wouldn't see otherwise. When I was recently over the summer giving a couple of workshops in Germany, and that was the time that Germany won the World Cup, and everyone in Germany was very happy about it and very loud about being very happy and very alcoholic about being very loud and very happy. So my contribution to the festivities was to line up some of the glasses and shoot them with my iPhone. Yeah, well, sometimes one just is like, okay, this is a foreign language. This is fun. It doesn't mean what I think it means, but I'm going to snap it. And it's important to look around you at breakfast, at dinner. Sometimes some of the best travel shots show what it's like to sit in a breakfast room and have breakfast. This is the part of a Shinto shrine where there's an offering made and people light the right candles. In the outskirts of Osaka, I made a train change at the kind of train stop that tourists don't normally see, and I had about an hour layover between trains. So I said, why not walk out here? And somewhat to my surprise, this is not the sort of pristine tourist Japan one expects. There are homeless people in the middle of this kind of place, and there are also these apartment buildings with this patterned stairs with external access that go up and up and up like this. Moral here is not so much about Japan, but rather that when you travel, there are going to be delays. Try to take advantage of the delays to explore and see what might be around you, and have a sense of humor about things. I don't know if you can read the sign here, but the way is not the kimono pilgrimage route. So, the way is not the way. Don't go down this road, or Lord knows what will happen with you, but maybe do go down it to see if there are any photos 100 feet down the road. This is the current leader in Japan on the wall there, Mr. Abe. And the funny thing about it is that there's a certain something about Western bosses that appeals to the Japanese culture. So here's a coffee machine, and it's the best-selling brand of coffee in Japan. And the logo is that guy, safari guy with the pipe, Boss Coffee. And you can get out of the machine there hot coffee in a can, cold coffee in a can, whatever kind you like. The way the hot works is it doesn't become hot until you snap the lid off the thing. In the rural ryokans that I stayed at, typically there for breakfast, it was not possible to get coffee with breakfast. So, and they thought I was kind of out of my mind for asking for it, because coffee is something that you have as a kind of pastry delicacy. A lot of people in Japan love coffee, but it's not typically thought of as a breakfast drink or drink with meals. So, there I was. I hadn't had coffee for breakfast. I walked a couple hundred yards, and around the corner was this machine, and I saw my host, who had sort of quietly gone out of the ryokan and was treating himself to a cup of coffee at this machine. So here are some more images of Japan, perhaps the parts of Japan that we don't quite think of so frequently as Japan. Personally, I don't like the big cities in Japan as much as I do the rural parts of Japan, which are really a different country, more like a third world country than the country we think of. This is a place called Takahara, which means high fields. This is dawn in the high fields, and that's the rice fields there are irrigated by that water wheel you see in the left of the photo. Here's a bigger version of it. One of the things that's pretty interesting to me about Japan is how much the Shinto tradition of ancestor worship lives on right next to the Buddhist culture and to what people do every day in their lives. In Kyoto, downtown, about a half mile from the hotel I was staying in, at sunset, I just walked down, and this is a river actually that runs through this part of Kyoto. And here's the pagoda at Nachisan. What I did here, my thought here in making this photo was to make a really, really, really long exposure, because what I wanted to do was to make the water become soft as it does with a long exposure, and also to do a long enough exposure that the visitors who are up on the various balconies of the pagoda would kind of disappear over time. So I used a 10x neutral density filter, and this is a many minutes exposure. That's so in my travel camera bag, I don't carry much in the way of filters. I do carry a polarizer and a 10x neutral density filter, which can be stacked together, because both are things that are pretty hard to replicate in post-production. The polarizer because of all the settings and the curvature, and the neutral density filter because once you've exposed, and if you want to make a longer exposure, you really have to do that at the time of exposure. This is an image shot along the pilgrimage trail, the Kimono Kodo on the Kii Peninsula. The trail's a World Heritage Site, and a lot of it is kind of like this, a combination of stone walkways and trails going through the fog, and every once in a while you might come out on a tea shop or a refreshment stop, but for the most part you don't see too many people there. Along the trail, on a rainy day, I carried my camera and everything else, including my laptop, including the laptop that you're listening to this on, in my pack. I had a pack cover, a waterproof pack cover. I also had an umbrella I got in Japan. I'll get to your question in a second, Bob. The umbrella kept everything dry. This is a place along the Kimono Kodo where the name of the spot is something like View of 10,000 Peaks, if you translated it. There probably aren't 10,000, but as you can see, there are quite a few peaks from there. So when I got up there, I sort of had a little dance and a little break in the rain. I managed to get the camera out and take quite a few photos, and this is one of them. When I said a 10x neutral density filter, that is a pretty dark, that's a 10 EV neutral density filter. That's a quite dark one. In fact, it's so dark that there are problems actually seeing through it. Typically, what you have to do is put the camera on the tripod, focus, compose and focus so that you've got that right, then screw the 10x neutral density filter on. If you do it the other way around, you simply can't see what you're doing. A more typical neutral density filter would be maybe 4x. If you think about shutter speeds, let's say that you can go to a 30th of a second. If you use a 4x neutral density filter, that would mean you can go to about an eighth of a second. You can see that a 10x one would be a lot darker. This is the moat of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. I shot using the polarizer that I mentioned a minute ago to bring out the reflections in the water. And this is a garden wall in the old imperial capital of Nara in Japan. And the moral here really is that look for patterns. I don't care. I would have photographed this if it were in my backyard. It's interesting that it's a garden in Japan, but that's not, it doesn't particularly matter really. It's about the colors and pattern. And it's not with an iPhone, but basically it's just a snapshot. I never did figure out what this guy with the big nose is, but somehow he has something to do with the stores where religious pilgrims buy certain kinds of souvenirs. The next slide, I'm waiting for it to show up, is of just some patterns of roofs when I was walking around and came upon this little town. It's important to look for details in the patterns in everyday life, not just in the things that tourists see. The banners outside temples, I'm not ever sure exactly what they say, but part of the point with something like this for me is how much fun it is to photograph the kind of motion. Some of it's in motion, some of it's not in motion. If you have the camera on a tripod, you can amplify the motion a little by panning. And this is a patterns in a garden, a rock garden in Kyoto with the shadows against the light part of it. This particular kind of garden is a raindrop garden, so the lines in it represent rain splashing in a pond with perhaps clouds reflected above. And this is a Shinto purification dragon. The dragon guards the purification ritual before you go into a temple. The purification ritual involves a rather elaborate way of washing hands and rinsing out your mouth, so you can see there's water coming out of the dragon. The sense I have is that this dragon is both a bit fierce but also a bit cuddly, and the real point of the garden is to protect people who come in and who are wanting to purify themselves before going to the next step of the ritual. The next shot is one of the elaborate gardens and reflections. This one is from the imperial city of Nara. And it's always interesting to look at things in black and white as well as in color. So moving from Japan to France, this vista, if you put the Eiffel Tower in a photo, everyone's going to know where you are. You don't have to say, I'm moving to France. Say, hey, this is France. To get the Eiffel Tower in a neat way means researching where is a nice high spot. This is a little bit of the architectural equivalent of looking for mountaintops. Probably the best mountaintop in Paris is the Tour Montparnasse, which is a 70-story black monolithic monstrosity built in the late 60s, where the good thing about it is the view of the Eiffel Tower, and you could shoot without having anything between you and the tower, and you don't see it from itself. It's totally out of keeping with the landscape, but it's great for night photography of the Paris landscape. This is a shot back up in the galleries at Sacré-Cœur, where you kind of see all the couples up there who are making out and carving their initials in the stone and creating this sort of great patina of time. And here's a closer up view of it. It hasn't been sort of sandblasted or cleaned up there since it was built maybe 100 years ago. I like to do antique post-production looks on some of my images of places that are themselves old, and also, frankly, there's a call for this kind of thing from some of my art world clientele, my decorator art clientele. The thing about this image is that if you looked at it really close, it's Sully's palace near the Marais in Paris. You'd see that there's quite a nice, sharp, almost fractal image of the palace itself through the open door there. This is the Château des Nazelles in Loire country near Amboise in the Loire Valley, and it's a bed and breakfast, a very attractive bed and breakfast, obviously. And it, again, is a point in case of choose where you stay carefully when you travel. If you stay someplace that's interesting, you're more likely to get interesting photos. Photographer Jay Mizell put it this way: want your photographs to be more interesting, put yourself in front of more interesting things. Well, if you stay in more interesting places, you're likely to put yourself in front of more interesting things, and you're likely to get better photos, particularly because all kinds of people won't be wandering around there. I visited many of the top tourist attractions and castles in the Loire, Chenonceau and so forth. But I didn't have as much productive image making as I did at this relatively modest place that I was staying. And the next image is another Loire Valley image, a formal garden called Valandre in the south of the Loire Valley. And again, this is processed to make it look like sort of an old-fashioned etching with sort of a photo frame around it. And this particular processing was done at the request of a decor client. The pollarded trees, for me, are one of the most special things about photographing in France, and I really like to look for patterns. This shot here is out the back of a very deluxe hotel in the Left Bank in Paris, a 4-star Paris hotel. So you don't necessarily expect to see this view out of a hotel window there. If you look carefully, you can see that somebody is storing sneakers outside their window, right across in the window there. I thought it was a really interesting view and a more interesting photo than the more cosmeticized view of Paris that one so often sees. So I'm going to say that one rule for making memorable travel photos is try not to be very cosmetic about it. Kenneth, in terms of am I bothered by the stray phone wire or shrub sticking in front of the picture, which picture were you referring to? And it's going to depend for me on the photo. Some of them I'm going to care very much, others I'm not. It depends on the point of the photo. It's not universally true. Certainly, in this image of the Ile de Saint-Louis and the Ile de Cité in Paris, if there were stray wires in it, I would pick them out, no doubt about it. Again, with a lot of my black and white travel images, my processing is intentionally done to make the images look almost 19th century or antique, or more like etchings than photos. They're not really contemporary photos. Sometimes with travel photography, as in the next shot, you just get lucky, as in this double rainbow over the Seine that's coming up. So I was sitting in my hotel room, and I noticed that in April, at the end of April in Paris, and I noticed that it was starting to really rain hard. And my initial reaction was to say, well, I'm so glad my camera is safe and dry, and so am I. Then I sort of looked out the window, and up the side I saw there might be a rainbow. So I grabbed an umbrella, grabbed the camera, ran out to one of the bridges over the Seine, and was lucky enough to just shoot this double rainbow with the Musée d'Orsay on the right there. Yeah, I mean, the question of whether I get rid of wires, etc., is really going to depend on the aesthetics of the image. Some it doesn't matter, but if on the other hand, if you're looking at something like a beautiful shot of an old castle and there's a microwave tower in it, that's not going to be something I'm going to want to keep in my image. And I will sometimes go to a lot of trouble to get rid of it there. On the other hand, you have to be careful about destroying the architectural integrity of what was there. So there's a balancing act. How much do you want to take away? How much do you not want to take away? It also depends, incidentally, both practically and ethically on the purpose of the image. National Geographic got into a really nasty scandal about a decade ago when they had a cover photo where the person had moved the pyramids for the cover. I personally wouldn't see anything wrong with moving the pyramids if the aesthetics of the image called for it, but it's against essentially the terms of engagement at National Geo and at some other publications. So you have to be careful about that. I think if they're going to retouch out something like wires at National Geo, they want to do it. They don't want the photographer doing it. They want to be pretty clear that what's in the raw image is what they get. So that probably means I couldn't do work for them because I do so much post-production. This, of course, is the beautiful Monet's garden at Giverny, using my polarizer to up the reflection. And this is a iPhone shot of the same bridge processed via a really neat app called Waterlog. And more Giverny. With this shot in the sort of warren of tourist streets right off the Boulevard Saint-Michel, right across from Notre Dame, there are these warren of streets that are usually full of people. What I simply did was I plunked the tripod down, I held it open for about 15 seconds, and then processed the bottom of the image for black and white and the top for color. It's something to think about, not so much the processing for black and white or for color, is that you can do interesting things with masses of people by changing the amount of time of the exposure that's used with them. Along the Seine, this is an example of moving the camera up and down for the right amount of time, about a third of a second here. This is a morning on the cliffs of the Lot River in southwestern France. You can see the path along the cliffs there. So it's maybe about a mile walk out from where you start hiking here, and really beautiful in the morning when the reflections are nice. This is the Pont Valentre in Cahors in southwestern France, a city that was decimated in the 100 Years' War many hundreds of years ago. But this bridge was never taken. The French held it from the British. They basically started creating forts from the middle out, and there's another fort on the right here that you can't see. So, I really thought this thing was like something out of Game of Thrones, a very, very romantic place. It was raining, so I had to shoot this fairly hurriedly. If you look carefully, you can see the drops of rain on the water. Bob, you might be interested to know that there were a bunch of high tension power lines in the back of this thing that I took out. Why not man the barricades and photograph some people when you're in Paris? My model and friend Kira. Also, France is still pretty bound up with what happened in the Second World War. This is inside the Holocaust Memorial on the tip of the Ile de Seine and Ile de Cité on the Seine, right right around the corner from Notre Dame. You know, millions of people every year go through Notre Dame. Very few of them bother with this memorial. It's worth having a look and thinking about this kind of thing when you travel and take photos too. This is the main staircase in the Heidelberg University Library. I'm a sucker for spiral stairs, as people who know me know. So one of the things I do when I travel is actually I research in advance using Google Images, Flickr, and other image sources. Where is there going to be an interesting staircase, particularly one that I can get into? For example, I have an upcoming trip that will take me in part to Portugal, and I'm going to visit a town called Oporto in part for the staircase that's in a bookstore in town there. This is a iPhone shot via an app called Waterlog of the Alta Brook, the old bridge that runs across the Neckar River to Old Heidelberg, shown in the background. I believe the next shot is a modern black and white, about a 30-second exposure, allowing the water to go flat of the same bridge. Incidentally, I'm having an exhibit opening about 10 days from now in a gallery in Heidelberg. They're using this photo as the invitation, so I'm excited about that. I wish I could be there, but I just can't get over for it. In the workshop, the black and white workshop that I did in Heidelberg, I asked one of the field assignments was to create a high key image inside this church. This is the Jesuit church in Old Heidelberg. Unlike most Catholic churches, it's been totally steam blasted, and the only dark thing I could find on it were the confessional curtains. So this is my version of the assignment. It's overexposed by about 3 f-stops. And it's the back of the pulpit stairs in this church. So moral for travel photography, look for details as well as an overall picture, and look for exposures that work high key and low key. Set up in my workshop along the street. I particularly framed it this way because of the one-way signs there and the bicycle, hoping somebody would come along a long enough exposure that this pretty girl in the blue dress obliged walking along. And this is the engine of a 2 chevaux, 2-horsepower car. It's fun to photograph really fancy engines, and I like doing that. But, you know, why not take something more modest like this? A friend of the person putting on the workshop had a garage where this was one of the cars in, so I visited him first scouting and then with the workshop, and we got the chance to photograph all the great cars there. In Heidelberg, before the Second World War, the university was not under civil or criminal jurisdiction of the state. This meant that if a student did something naughty, only the university could punish them. This is the university jail. This is a cell in the university jail. Most typically, what the kids did was things like, you know, had too much beer and did a peeing contest in the public street or something like that. We're mostly not talking murder. So it became a thing where it was kind of fashionable to have your week in the Heidelberg University jail, and the good old boys would come back and check the place out and see that's where I put my painting on the wall. Many of these paintings and graffiti come from the years leading up to the First World War. You can see the one that's 1905 on the left there. So you have to figure that many of the people who were written on the wall there died in the trenches of the First World War. This is the formal great lecture hall in Heidelberg, shot via HDR. Unusual to get in there with nobody there, so I was lucky to be able to do it. An iPhone image of a spiral stair that goes up the side of what's billed as the world's largest barrel of beer in the Heidelberg Castle. And a statue of Bacchus, as long as we're on the alcohol theme, a statue of Bacchus in the gardens at a place called Rottenburg am Taub, one of the best preserved medieval cities in Germany. This guy's a tobacco farmer in rural Cuba. This is a place called Matanzas. It's a rural provincial capital in Cuba, where sometimes called the Venice of Cuba. So I heard Venice of Cuba. I saw the bridge. I saw the rivers, and I think what I figured was I would process this to make it look like a Canaletto painting, an oil painting of one of the people who would have painted Venice, literally. Incidentally, Bob, for you, in terms of this image, the original has quite a few things like power lines and microwave stuff in it that, for the most part, I took out because it just did not go with the look. This is a tenement. This is a stairwell in a tenement in Havana, and it probably was an elegant house before the revolution, but it's certainly a run down at this point. To get this photo with a extreme wide angle lens, I had to stand on the top of a toilet tank that they very graciously lugged out for me so I could look straight down the thing. You know, a fun shot. It wasn't the easiest in the world to make, but that's life. And this is looking up the same set of stairs from the bottom lobby of this particular tenement. Sometimes the most interesting buildings are not the ones that are on the tourist circuit. So this goes back to my suggestion that you do research via Flickr and Google Images for the interesting things that aren't what people think of as the typical places to go. This, I thought that this pattern of a cross in the sky was really interesting in Havana. These are basically abandoned buildings in downtown Havana. To get the image, I had to lie on my back in the middle of the street, actually in the gutter, and point straight up. And the next image that's going to come on here in a minute or two is of the Capitolo Nacional in Havana, a place where democracy reigned in Cuba for about 6 months in the 1930s. All right, there we are. Here's the Capitolio. Anyhow, here's a country where people are really hungry, and there's some wonderful things there, but there are also some things that go on that are not so great. And here's this incredibly ornate, upkept monument that is basically just sitting there in the middle of right next to Old Havana. And another shot of the same, a fisheye again lying on my back. I do like to understand the backstory about places where I am. This is in every town in Cuba, including Havana, has a revolutionary museum. The gentleman on the right is, of course, Che. The gentleman on the left is pretty well known in Cuba, but less well known to us. He's a man named Cienfuegos. And so there's their diorama in the Revolutionary Museum. These outward facing bullet holes. One of the big developments in the revolution were the martyrs who got into a bakery truck, about 100 of them in one little truck, drove up to Batista's palace and actually almost succeeded in a coup d'etat. They were all shot to death in the truck. The truck's been preserved and it's sitting in the Revolutionary Museum. Incidentally, we're, of course, the villains in most diorama displays in Cuba. It's kind of interesting to see the Bay of Pigs from their point of view. There's a Bay of Pigs museum. There also are all these various martyrs in American prisons who are Cubans, and the Cuban government has posters. When will they ever see their children again? They're people who have been convicted for spying in Florida and that kind of thing. Deborah, can you say which image you're talking about, sweetie? The curved image, you mean this guy? This is a fisheye lens. So which image? What question? Fire it up at me. It's the fisheye, of course, that makes the distortion of the lines a 10.5 millimeter fisheye. Okay, good, perfect. I love it when I answer the question. So this abstraction here is a wire sculpture in Revolutionary Square where they have Castro, Che, and Cienfuegos up in these sculptures that cast these shadows out. I stepped off onto the grass from Revolutionary Square to photograph this thing, to make this shot. And the next thing I knew, there were a couple of 17-year-olds with semi-automatics aimed at me. So, of course, I very carefully got off the grass and stopped photographing. One of my morals of travel photography, and I think I wrote this out on a slide later in this presentation in case one needs reminder of it, is when people come pointing semi-automatic weapons at you, stop what you're doing. You know, we live in one of the most beautiful places in the world, and most beautiful parts of the world. People travel all over the world to visit Yosemite, San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge, Point Reyes National Seashore, and so on. There's no reason on earth why we shouldn't go and photograph in these places and make our own images and also practice what travel photography would be like in other places. I really feel privileged to live in this part of the world. The last couple of images are Yosemite in the winter. From where I live, Yosemite is about 5 hours door to door, depending on traffic. In the wintertime, you have to carry chains up there, but often the valley floor isn't covered with snow particularly. And it's the best time of year to be there as far as I'm concerned. No crowds and incredibly gorgeous. This is a summertime image of about 3 hours of star circles from Glacier Point. You can see the Half Dome there. You can see pointing north is just to the left of the tree. So I spent all night shooting here. And in the morning, I was driving over the Tioga Road. I found myself, I fell asleep on the Tioga Road, woke up with my wheels off the side of the road, which of course is a scary thing. So the moral here is if you're photographing all night, be sure to get a few hours sleep before you try to drive across a mountain pass. Here's a moonrise over Port Oakland from the San Francisco waterfront. And another moon coming through the Bay Bridge having its light show on. Bob, I used the Nikon MC36. Bob wanted to know what intervalometer I use. I use the Nikon MC36. The deal basically with it is you put your camera on bulb, and then you can use any length exposures you want via the camera. You have to be careful that you don't have mirror lockup on, that you have long exposure noise reduction off. There's a veritable checklist of stuff you do for night photography, but that's the story there. This is a shot from the side of Bixby Bridge going down Route 1 in Big Sur, and another workshop shot where I set the camera up, let the intervalometer go, and help people in the workshop while it was processing, maybe about an hour and a half here. And this is a view of a moonrise from Kirby Cove below the Golden Gate Bridge. One of my favorite shots to shoot the Golden Gate Bridge. They're tearing down the old Bay Bridge in the Bay Area. This is an old cast iron structure from the 1930s. I think it's very beautiful in its own way. When I was walking along the pedestrian pathway of the new bridge, I was able to poke my camera down in the old one. This is something you never would have been able to do when traffic was rolling there. So it was neat to take this view of the patterns of light and dark without traffic. This is the curves in Lombard Street. So Lombard Street, Lombard Street is a great place to practice car trails. I mean, the real variable when you do stars is motion. Of course, it's not the motion of the stars, it's the motion of the Earth, but still, you're doing photography that exploits what happens to stars on the trails they make of light over time. Well, the same thing is true with cars. And again, the variable is what speed the car is going and how long you open your shutter for and things like that. But the Lombard Street curves are a very, very cool place to play with that. I just sent off a 66-inch print of this on metallic paper for exhibit in New York. This is a interior at Grace Church in San Francisco, where there was some kind of art installation going on that, in combination with the lights, made this sort of streamer of stuff coming down look. And, in San Francisco, many of the street paintings are very cool too. Underneath the Berkeley Pier. This is a pier that goes out about a half mile into San Francisco Bay. At low tide, you can make your way underneath the pier and set up a camera. It's not for the faint of heart. It's only safe at extra low tide, and it's not for the squeamish, because there most certainly are things like crabs and rats down there, as I can attest. So part of what I look for, whether I'm abroad or at home, are unusual kinds of perspective lines, like under the pier, and also buildings that aren't necessarily in the best shape they've ever been. Sometimes buildings that are falling down, like this old part of the ferry terminal in Point Richmond, are the most interesting things to photograph. This is the rebuilt pavilion that's part of the Rosie the Riveter National Monument in Richmond, California. And part of what I enjoyed photographing here was the reflections in the floor. The question was asked whether this and the last 2 or 3 shots are HDR, and the answer is yes. These are bracketed sequences of between 3 and 7 shots that have been combined, both using hand HDR, using painting and layers, and also using automated HDR program. This is the image that started this slideshow. It's perhaps more an image of place than a travel photo. It's shot from the Bolinas Ridge below Mount Tamalpais to the town of Stinson Beach, which is a break in the cloud. And with the sunset setting behind the cloud bank of Point Reyes. Bob, the best book for HDR is the AM Photo Creating HDR Photos, I think, because that explicitly covers many of the different, and thank you for the chance to do a plug, by the way, because that explicitly covers both Photomatics and Nik HDR FX, as well as the distinctions between hand HDR, automated HDR, how to use them both in the same shot, and the whole gamut of stuff. And, I hit people who say, I hate HDR. And I think that's actually kind of silly. If you look at a picture and it says, think about HDR, not the place, well, then that's no longer really a travel photo in anybody's definition. And probably the HDR has gone too far. But HDR, like anything else, is a technique. It's not a style. And it can be used, it can be abused, it can be overused, but it also can be wonderful and add dimensionality and interest to photos as well. This is from Drake's Beach in Point Reyes. It's a wave shot coming in. So travel, of course, is about people. The two most common questions I get about photographing people are related, and one is, do you ask permission? And two, do you get a model release? My people do these things differently. I like to ask permission if I can, but if it's going to ruin the shot, I take the shot first and then ask permission. You know, and the saying, better to do wrong and take your punishment than to never try to do anything. If I take a picture of someone and they really look at me and they say you're a terrible person, then I will delete it if they request me to do so. But most of the time, I like to talk to people before I photograph them. That works better for me. In terms of releases, unless I'm involved in an assignment, which sometimes happens for me, I don't get a commercial release. I do when I'm working with models in the studio, but for people on the street, I don't get a commercial release. That means I can't use the photos in some kinds of advertisements, and I can't give them to stock agencies. But since I don't do those things, I don't worry about it. In the United States, if you photograph someone on the street and you're not using it for advertising and you don't use it in a derogatory way about them, you don't really need a release for anything. I can use them in my books. I can make prints of them. And those are the things I care about most. The question, of course, is when is a photograph of a model more like a photo? Well, it is what it is. The next shot that's coming up is actually a model. And there were really two shots here, one for Kira the model, the other for the metro train coming into Passy Station, and I combined the two in Photoshop. It's really very, very easy to practice people photography with a good model, of course, because they know how to pose. So I spent the better part of a day with Kira, the model shown here, photographing in locations in Paris, and that was really a whole heck of a lot of fun. It was great. Here she is in a cafe. One day in Paris, I went out to La Défense, which is sort of the corporate mecca outside of Paris, where all these big corporations have their international headquarters, and it's a stone and glass temple to industry, basically. And I was sort of figuring, well, how am I going to get an interesting photo here? So what I decided to do was to focus on the stairs and let people go out of focus, like this sort of striver heading up the stairs. So I think the message I want to send with this photo is that length of exposure time is one of the key controls you play with in photography and photography of places. In particular, you can move the camera yourself during a long exposure to get a different look. Something else to play with is focus. If you control the focus and don't let autofocus do it, you can do interesting things with the various planes in your photo. This gentleman I met on the streets in Trinidad, Cuba, and I asked him, can I take your photo? And he said, sure. And I think he seems like a very nice man. He's lived an interesting life, and I really enjoyed photographing him. I'd suggest that you photograph on people's eyes in this kind of portrait. And you also, perhaps if it's not going to be that easy to make sure you have pinpoint focus on the eyes, you want to do it with enough depth of field so that you'll be able to be in focus on the eyes, even if you don't quite nail the focus. These two girls and their mama were across the street from the Capitol in Havana the day I got there, and they came up to me and they said, buy us some milk, please. And I was foolish enough basically to say, sure. I went into the local store with them and bought some extremely expensive powdered milk, and then they ran off and I never saw them again, although luckily I was able to photograph them first. But it's a living reminder to me that sometimes I can be a bit foolish, because obviously this was some kind of scam. One good thing the government in Cuba does is provide milk for all kids. So they didn't really need the milk. They needed my money. Here's a guy who makes cigars outside a cigar factory in Havana. Again, the secret of getting this kind of photo is to talk to the people. If you don't talk to them, you're not going to have any kind of relationship or rapport, and there's no reason why they should give to you as you take the photo. When I say talk, by the way, I will say that my Spanish is fairly rudimentary. I can say, hola, ¿cómo está? Muy bien, ¿y tú? And so on, but I can't go much further than that. So talk doesn't have to be verbal, and it doesn't have to be hugely articulate, but you do have to get up some kind of basis for I'm me, you're you, we're people, what are you doing today, how are things, what do you want to know from me, what can I do for you? And if you do that kind of basics and treat people with respect, you'll get a lot better portraits from them than if you just try to barrel through it. This guy makes his living because he's on the cover of one of the Lonely Planet guides to Cuba. You can see the book in the lower left of this photo. So he sits there and he solicits money for another picture of himself. I think he's pretty picturesque, but I think shooting him with the cover of the book he was on really added something to it. These guys were in a school. Of course, that's Che behind them. Don't know how the guy broke his arm. Oh, I can't do a photographing people without showing my family. There's Katie going left to right, Katie at the lower left bottom, Matthew, Julian's the big guy behind them, and then Nikki's behind on left. And there's Phyllis and Katie Rose when she was a baby. Again, note the camera is focused on the baby's eyes. That's the right place for it to be focused. And no, they don't have to be so serious all the time either. Humor is a great thing to have in portraits. Whether they'll think it's child abuse when she's a teenager remains to be seen. Here's Matthew completely multitasking. Okay, you get the idea. And there's Katie in her karate outfit. They all do karate. So we're in the process of wrapping this presentation up. That means that people should be thinking about questions they may have. So lesson 1, if a gun is pointed at you, stop photographing. The reason I have this door knocker here is that it doesn't just happen in Cuba. I was walking home from photographing the Eiffel Tower back to the hotel with a group of people a couple of years ago in the workshop I was doing. I stopped with my macro lens and started to photograph this lovely door knocker, and a couple of nice French soldiers with semi-automatic weapons told me to stop at once. It turned out it was the mansion of the formal mansion of the president of France in there, although like sort of photographing something on our White House, but I guess security is a little better in France. I didn't show in this presentation the image that the rattlesnake interrupted, but in general, if a rattlesnake slithers around your tripod, stand very still. Research. My joke is that it used to be really hard to find the right places and the right times to be there. These days, the internet makes it easy. You've got Google Images. You've got the image library on Flickr. You've got all kinds of travel photo resources online. You can also use TPE. Bob, why don't you hold that? It's a great question. Why don't you hold it for the general Q&A that I'll get to in a couple of minutes? Great question, though. The TPE, the photographer's ephemeris, will tell you for any place on the planet when sunrise, sunset are, when moonrise, moonset are, and more importantly, what the direction of each is. So that means you can actually plan shots like that one with the dragon sculpture in the desert. I recommend talking to people wherever you go. If you don't talk to people, you'll miss many opportunities. People like to help photographers. This bend in the Dordogne River is an overlook. The guy I was staying with said to me, "It's my favorite spot in the whole world. Not many people know about it. There's a little trail to it out of a particular parking lot." So I went there, and there was rain on one side and not on the other, and I shot this panorama. And be open to adventures. The general wisdom of photography, and travel photography in particular, is that one is on a quest. You have some goal, some destination, but if they're detours that seem fun, take them. Have adventures. Um, yeah, photography works best with other photographers or alone. Paradoxically, what doesn't usually work too well is traveling with non-photographers. If I've heard all these stories about people who travel with their spouses or with other groups, and the group's always waiting for them, or they're missing the shot because they're catching up with the group. So, I like to travel alone a lot of the time, but sometimes with other photographers is fun too, if one doesn't get in each other's way. But think about who you're going with when you photograph. This Yosemite in the winter image, I was there to make it. It took about a couple hours to actually shoot this right. I was there with my son, Julian, who was making the world's largest snowball that you can see to his left in the Merced River there. And here's the gold-plated footsteps of Ansel Adams up at Tunnel View, looking out at the valley. This kind of situation really makes it pretty hard, in my opinion, to do good creative photography because, first of all, there's simply a how do I get in there kind of issue. And then if there are 20 people lined up to do this shot, well, kind of what's the point? A good exhortation. Be there now, travel in the moment. I've got a couple of travel photo workshops coming up. And I do have webinar recordings that cover a lot of specific techniques, and particularly Photoshop kinds of things. And here's my contact info one more time. Let me throw this open for questions. I will start with Bob's, what lenses do I carry when traveling? There's no one answer to that that's going to work for everybody, and no lens is right for every situation. And whatever happens, there's going to be times where you're going to say, why don't I have that lens? That said, the key thing to do is probably to travel light. I mean, it's astounding to me that I've got a 36 megapixel full frame capture inside my Nikon D810, but even so, that's probably a bulkier camera than most people want to carry. So what I carry with that camera is I carry the Nikon 28 to 300 millimeter lens because that's a good walking around lens. It's not an optically great lens at any point on its spectrum, but it goes all the way from a decent wide angle to a pretty decent telephoto lens, 28 to 300 in a fairly small package and form frame. Then when I want to do more, when I want or am able to do more high quality optical work, I carry 2 or 3 of my Zeiss lenses. Since I am a Zeiss lens ambassador, I do have access to these wonderful optics. So usually I'll have the 15 millimeter 2.8 Zeiss extreme wide angle with me, probably the 35 millimeter 1.4 and the 135 f2. These are special purpose lenses. They're not autofocus lenses. What they really do is they're really just optically superb. They're heavy as all get out. I mean, when I first started carrying these lenses, I said to a friend, well, how am I going to manage to carry all this stuff all the time? And he said, well, you go to the gym and work out. And I said, well, I don't really have time to do a lot of that. And he said, well, lift these lenses. That's working out. If the 85 1.4 Otis is available to me in time, I'll probably carry that next month when I go to Spain, Morocco, and Portugal. Depending on where I was going and what I intended to shoot, I might also carry a macro lens. Bob, does that answer your lens question? Well, I'm going to take it that's sort of a yes. I'm going to also say that my choice of lenses depends on my shooting style to a great extent. A lot of what I do involves tripod work. And so I'm actually always carrying a tripod with me too, which I kind of hate doing, but I have to do it. If I didn't do a fair amount of sequence shooting and shooting in low light conditions, I probably wouldn't carry a tripod. If I weren't somebody who makes my living at this, meaning therefore, in my case, I have to be prepared to do really large prints. I have one art world client who specifically wants things that can be blown up to 10 feet wide a lot of the time. I would probably carry something more like a mirrorless camera. I mean, there is a real problem with carrying the kind of weight around that I carry around, but it's the only way I found to do it. Trade-offs. Photography is a craft and art of trade-off, and that is certainly true in travel photography. Monopods are not for Herald. Herald is not for monopods. I can't use it reliably to do a bracketed sequence. Therefore, many parts of what I'm carrying a tripod for are not usably able to do with a monopod, alas. The truth is that there are advantages to monopods. Not only are they lighter weight than tripods, but places that will forbid tripods, e.g. a fair number of Buddhist temples in Japan, will allow you to use a monopod because they're not as familiar with them. And they don't think they're going to interrupt traffic in the same way. So there are people for whom monopods are useful. I'm not one of them. Any other questions? Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, I'm going to say thank you very much to everyone. Do not hesitate to send me an email if you have thoughts or questions after the fact. Happy travels. Make photos. Don't specifically think of them as travel photos, but think of them as good photos. And thank you, everybody, very much. I'm going to end the recording at this point, but I'll stay online for a little bit in case anybody has anything they want to ask me.